Examples and thought experiments. These are some thoughts on Locke, and I've tried to put his examples and his thought experiments into some visuals to help you remember what they are and how they work. So let's have a look. Does it actually matter which term I use? Um, I have noticed over past exams, the examiners have used the phrase either example or thought experiments, um, seemingly interchangeably. However, in the study design, they specify that you should know the difference between what an example and what a thought experiment is. Um, and on occasion, they have asked for um, outline and explain one of Locke's thought experiments. And then the students that have used examples have received no points. Okay, so it is important, it does matter which term you use and that you understand what both terms mean, because this shows that you understand how the philosopher is working. What does an example do? An example shows a point the thinker is making. I know this may sound fairly simplistic, it may sound very obvious, but it's really worth articulating it and getting it in our minds, so it's clear in our minds. The basic format of an example is this shows this, or A shows B. For an example of an example. Even if a parrot was rational, we would still call it a parrot and not a man. This shows that rationality is not a necessary and sufficient criterion for man. Another example of an example would be the severed hand. If you cut off a hand, then it is no longer a part of self. This shows that substance is not a necessary and sufficient criterion for personal identity. So we could look here. Here's any one of you, when you've become business women for some reason. I don't know why business women go with high heels and skirts. I think it's that show. What was it called? About the lawyers. Anyway, here she is, and we sever the hand, and our understanding is that she is still the person standing there wearing the purple top, with the high heels and the hair and the eyes and the mind and the thoughts, not the physical bit of flesh and bone and blood and stuff, which is the hand. Now, a bit of a spoiler. If any of you are Game of Thrones fans or intending to watch Game of Thrones, you might want to skip the next 10 seconds or so. If you've watched it, this might actually help you remember. So, in Game of Thrones, there is a famous account of someone having their hand severed. There it is. I won't say if you don't know who it is who has their hand severed, but they have their hand severed. The interesting thing for us is the character who chops the hand off, his name is Locke, which makes me think that one of the Game of Thrones writers was having a little philosophy joke. Maybe he or she was sitting back laughing to themselves going, that is the cleverest thing that anyone's ever done, without anyone else realizing what they were actually referencing. So there you go, Locke chopping off someone's hand. The hand gets thrown away. I think actually he gets forced to wear the hand around his neck, the character. Gets forced to wear the hand around his neck until it eventually rots and is thrown away. In which case, as we can see, it is not him. He remains even though the hand is gone, even though the material substance is gone. So there you go. Game of Thrones philosophy tied together. What does a thought experiment do? A thought experiment is a way or a method to explore the potential consequences of an idea or principle. The basic form of a thought experiment is, if this is the case, then what is the consequence of this? If X, what is the consequence of Y? For example, let us accept the principle that the criterion for personal identity is consciousness, self-awareness. If this is the case, then what would be the consequence of shifting the soul, in which the consciousness resides, into another body? To explore this, let us imagine the soul of a prince was shifted into the body of a cobbler. Now, the prince would think of himself as being the prince, even though he was in a different body. So that's a thought experiment that Locke presents us with. Here's another one. Let us accept the principle that self is the conscious thinking thing that is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. If this is the case, then if a finger were separated from the consciousness, if a finger were separated but the consciousness went with the finger, then what would the consequence be? According to the principle we're testing, the separated finger with consciousness would be the person. From this, we can conclude that person is identified with the consciousness as far as it can be extended. Now, if I asked you, can anyone see a possible criticism of Locke here? I'm certain you're all saying that that is effectively a circular argument. You start out with your conclusion, you say, if this is the conclusion, then what can we draw from it? Well, we can draw the conclusion. Here it is. Here's a hand. I'm certain you're all ready for a little bit of gory blood as the finger is severed. There he goes. But the consciousness is in the finger. So where is person now? The finger is the person. But it's not as simple as just looking for an if in the statement, the wording of however something is presented. What do we find in Locke's text? Okay. In the text, the first thing we actually find is an example of a person being turned into a hog. Hilo Galabus, turned into a hog. This is actually not in our examinable text. I'm just mentioning it because it's the sort of the first one. In this case, it's I think this might be going back to the Odyssey, because as you will all know, in the Odyssey, Odysseus and his men turn up on Kerkes Island, where they are turned into pigs. I can't remember if this chap is one of those. For the sake of the argument, let's say it is. And they are turned into pigs. As Locke is saying here, the person remains, but the man does not. And you'll all remember from our other video on Locke and the PowerPoint on Locke, Locke initially presents three possible criterion or ideas about where identity resides, and the substance, man, the generic term, and person. The second one he looks at, or the first one he looks at in our text, the VCE text, is the rational parrot. This is an example. Rationality does not make man, is the conclusion. Then there's the severed hand. It is an example. Self stays where the consciousness is. The next one talks to someone who claims to be Socrates reincarnated. He also uses Nestor and Thersites. I should have studied Greek. But they are all examples that if that person goes with consciousness. We'll look at all these in a little bit more detail now. The rational parrot. Here you go. Basically, he uses this example, regardless of whether or not he believes there is a rational parrot. He uses this example to say that even if there was a parrot that had rationality, we would not talk about it as a man. We would simply say it is a rational parrot. Okay, so rationality does not make man. Another consequence of this is that man does not make rationality. So just because something is a man doesn't make that thing rational. Hence, man is not going to be the criteria for person either. But that's not the immediate point Locke is making here. Okay, the focus you want to draw is rationality does not make man. That's what he's immediately saying right there. The severed hand. This is a nice, simple example. There we go again. Woo! The self or identity, the principle of identity, remains where the consciousness is. But of course, this comes back to his definition of identity as consciousness. So this can be criticized as a circular argument. Reincarnation. Here we have the idea that an immaterial substance or soul can transverse through numerous material vessels or numerous material substances, or even numerous material versions of man. But if one of these vessels does not remember the previous vessel, then it does not have the awareness or the consciousness that is required for person. So the example he looks at with reincarnation, and he gives some specific examples of reincarnation: Socrates, Nestor, Theret. I hate that name. I should learn how to say it from one of my friends who speaks Greek. Thersites. Hopefully, I'll have to look that up one day. Only the same person if they have the same consciousness. Okay? That means that the immaterial substance is not the thing that is making person. It is the consciousness. Just as a matter of interest as we go through, here's some interesting examples from the wonderful world of the internet, where people have suggested that these are examples of reincarnation. Of course, with reincarnation, in the many theories of reincarnation, it is the transference of an immaterial substance or soul between material vessels. The material vessels are not meant to look the same, whereas what the internet tends to think of when they think of reincarnation is, oh, this person looks like some person from the past, i.e. their material vessels are the same. You don't need any of this for the exam. Just thought it was a bit of fun to look at. There's Orlando Bloom, who you probably know, someone who apparently looks a little bit like him. Sylvester Stallone looking like Pope Gregory the Ninth. Maybe Pope Gregory with a boxer. Justin Timberlake, and Justin Timberlake apparently with a beard in the past. Oh, gosh, that's a close one. Maggie Gyllenhaal. Bruce Willis. Jimmy Fallon, and Jimmy Fallon in the past. My goodness, that's another very close looking one, isn't it? And that's a really interesting one. There's Leo and Judy Zipper. Anyway, let's move on. What else does he include in the text? next moves to a thought experiment, which is a very famous thought experiment called The Prince and the Cobbler. In this thought experiment, you'll know this thought experiment from the other video I've done. You'll be able to describe it. The conclusion that he draws from this thought experiment is that the same person goes with the soul. The body, even though the same person goes with the soul, the body too goes to making of the man, particularly in the ordinary way of speaking. So when the soul of the prince goes into the cobbler, the person of the prince goes to the cobbler, but the man of the cobbler remains, and in the ordinary way of speaking, according to people who see the cobbler, they will still refer to him as the cobbler. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a second. Then the next one he has is Noah's flood and the overflowing of the Thames. This is an example, again, trying to show that the immaterial substance does not alone make man. Self depends on extended consciousness. Really here he was trying to demonstrate the idea of extension of consciousness through time. That's why he was referring to Noah's Ark and something that happened in the past. He's really emphasizing the extension of consciousness through time. The separation of the little finger, and Socrates and Mayor of Quinborough. Let's have a look at Prince and the Cobbler. Probably one of the most famous thought experiments you find in philosophy, and particularly in the theory of identity, and one that regularly comes up on exams. Probably every second year or so you get this print in it, outline and explain the Prince and the Cobbler. So here you have a lovely picture of a prince and a cobbler, and the thought experiment says that the soul of the prince goes into the cobbler, and you'll notice the prince disappears. It's not that the cobbler's soul then goes into the prince. That's a mistake that many people make. It's not necessary for this thought experiment. What he's basically asking would be what would the prince, who has the consciousness and awareness, who would he think he is? Would he think he is the prince or the cobbler? And he would think he is the prince because he has all the memories of the prince, the self-awareness of the prince. However, he would appear, as we have in the picture, as the cobbler. How would, in the ordinary way of speaking, how would the ordinary people around refer to this person or this thing, this picture you can see in front of you right now? Most people who walked into that store are going to say, "Hello, cobbler." They're going to refer to the cobbler because that's what they see. Their sense of identity, how they describe identity, is shaped and rooted in the man. That's in the ordinary way of speaking. Obviously, the prince will not refer to himself as the cobbler. He will refer to himself as the prince. The trouble here is, so the chap you can see on your screen at the moment with a shoe and a hammer to fix the shoe, cobbler's hammer. If someone says, "Hello, cobbler," I don't know why they're suddenly speaking in a cool Cockney accent. "Hello, cobbler." So they'll say, "Hello, cobbler." And he will say, "I am the prince. Do not refer to me as the cobbler." But they have no way of verifying that he is the prince. They have no way of verifying his consciousness and self-awareness. This, of course, is rooted in the problem of other minds. When you look at this scenario, he deliberately chose a rich prince and a poor cobbler. Locke deliberately chose a rich prince and a poor cobbler to make his point. Obviously, it is in the cobbler's it would be in the cobbler's interest to pretend to be the prince. So maybe the prince just vanished, and we, the onlookers, we have no way of verifying that his soul went into the cobbler. Obviously, it would be in the cobbler's best interest to say, I am now the prince, because the prince is richer than him. So that's the prince and the cobbler. The main takeaway from that is that the person goes with the soul, but the body too goes to the making of man, particularly in the ordinary way of speaking, when third person onlookers have no way of verifying the consciousness and awareness because of the problem of other minds. Locke then suggests, well, what if I'm sitting here and I remember Noah's flood? Obviously, the body of Locke, I can't remember, let's pretend he was, how old does he look there? Sprightly, maybe around about 52, pretend. I don't know how old he was when he wrote this. Let's pretend. So obviously 52-year-old Locke, the 52-year-old body substance, the 52-year-old man is not going to have, or did not exist thousands and thousands of years ago at the time of Noah's Ark, treating Noah's Ark as a historical account rather than a metaphor. Put that aside. Just hold on a second. I need to plug in my computer, which looks like it is about to die. And are we ready? Bang. Gone. So here we go. Locke says, what if he were to remember Noah's Ark, or remember, sorry, I got a little bit thrown by recharging my computer, or remember the flooding of Thames last winter. And his point here is it's the remembering. So with the flooding of the Thames, that is entirely possible because that is within the time. It was last winter, it was last year. It is within the extended lifespan of his substance and his man. Okay? But the Ark, of course, is not within the extended substance or man of Locke. But if he were to remember Noah's Ark, then his identity, the identity of that which remembered the Noah's Ark to now, or there would be identity between those two moments of consciousness because of the shared memory. So immaterial substance or soul does not alone make man. Self depends on the extended consciousness. That is the takeaway from this. I haven't explained that one very well because I got sort of thrown by having to recharge my computer midway through. My aim was not to overly explain these with this little movie. My aim was really to give you visuals so that you remembered the example. In the other PowerPoint we have and the other movie you have on Locke, they are explained a bit more clearly, hopefully. Basically, the point he's making here is very similar to the one he made with reincarnation earlier. We've gone through the separation of the little finger, but again, it's turned up on exams a couple of times that I can think of. Often this one is a tricky one on exams because students confuse it with the separation of the hand. The severed hand versus the separation of the little finger. Okay. The finger, if you see the word finger, you are thinking thought experiment and you are thinking that it shows that the consciousness resides Where the consciousness resides is where identity is found, where person is. There he is again. Now I am the person. Brilliant. A genius. Socrates and the Mayor of Quinsborough, and Socrates awake and Socrates asleep. If they do not partake of the same consciousness, they are different persons. Just some visuals there then. Here's the classic visual of Socrates, just about to take his hemlock. I'm just noticing that some guy's groping him up. It's a bit rough. And it was very hard to find a photo of Socrates asleep. That's Socrates asleep, although, if I'm really honest, I suspect that's a statue of Socrates dead. Sorry, Socrates. All right, now the idea here was just to give you visuals so you would remember the examples. I hope it's helped a little bit.